the production model for an operator is very tree-like. Build a central office, then build some distribution points, and then build some base stations at the end of that, or even some customer endpoints. It's very tree-like. It's very plumbing.
Hello and welcome to the second in this special three-part series of Telecoms.com podcasts that are being produced in partnership with Worldwide Technology. In the first one, we introduced the concept of Edge from a telecoms perspective, spoke a little bit about some of the opportunities there for telcos, especially as involves partnerships. In this one, as well as our returning speaker, Daniel Valle, who's the EMEA CTO of WWT, I'm happy to welcome Henry Calvert from the GSMA. Just going to remind myself what you do again, Henry. You are the head of future networks at GSMA. Now, given that we finished off our last conversation talking about partnerships, and the GSMA is right in the middle of the telecoms industry with a view to facilitating partnerships, it seems completely appropriate to pass the ball to you first off. So I'm going to ask you, Henry, to just tell us a little bit about what it is you do at the GSMA, and then expand a bit on the edge opportunity for telcos and why partnerships are such an important part of that.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you very much, Daniel and WWT, for this opportunity to speak at this podcast. So I'm Henry Calvert. I'm head of the Future Networks at the GSMA, and I'm responsible to looking at the transition of the mobile industry from the different generations and the infrastructure that they're actually deploying. So we've looked at, the digital transition between 3G and 4G. We're looking at the transition between 4G and 5G, surprisingly enough, and hopefully one day we'll look from 5G to 6G later on. So, and that comes with a lot of complexities in the way that we're doing. And like ever before, technology changes, and with that change comes different strategic approaches. It comes with different technology challenges, and it also comes with some policy and regulation changes as well. So at the GSMA, we try and make sure the industry is really set up so we can scale for the best economic outcome that we're doing. So what we're doing here. We see the edge emerging. It's been emerging for a long time. And we've seen the hyperscalers, build their services and their capabilities. And operators have been providing the connectivity for the majority of time. The strengths of where the operators are is, they have built significant infrastructure, not only networking, but also the fiber that they've actually deployed in the networks. But they've also built a number of facilities. And when you think about it, if you come into a market, a local market, operators have, tens of central offices. This was the switch locations. And then, they built points of distribution in the towns and the villages, to connect people together. And then every one of these towns and cities would have been building base stations where mobile towers have been deployed. And there are thousands of these towers per market, maybe even per city. And this gives operators a huge opportunity to monetize the infrastructure that they've deployed, and also the sites and the locations that they've actually had. And we've been in a world where operators have been monetizing this access through services like voice and messaging for 10, 20 years. I think I can still remember the dim and distant times of sending a text message to people. It's very different these days. They've moved and transitioned into providing data services and capacity to customers in the way that people have now fulfilled their lives through very different apps and services. And these apps and services have really, brought on new value pools within the industry. Operators have monetized the access, let's say, and then we have the new application service industry. And this is where the hyperscalers, or we could talk about the gamies out there that have actually really brought a different way of living that we actually see. Now, there have been partnerships that have grown over that period of time with the hyperscalers or with the gamies, and that's Google, Microsoft, eBay, Yahoo, etc. I think that's the old terminology for it. I'm probably about 2 years out of date on that. And these partnerships have been growing over time. But as we move towards the edge, there is a certain value that the operators can now bring to the likes of the hyperscalers, where the customer experience can improve so much. So you can get lower latency, or you can get fast broadband, or you can even get resilience for where you're delivering it. Even the information of actually providing something just in one town and how that behaves in the data mining that we see is very, very important to an application developer sitting on a hyperscaler. So these partnerships are very important. Now, the weakness that the operator has, I think, is that the fact that they don't have a great relationship with the application developers, the third-party developers that have built up over time with the hyperscalers. The other weakness that they actually have is that operators are still trying to provide the demands that customers are actually wanting when they're actually using their devices or they're using data services. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant. They're trying to actually still fulfill that demand. And the transformation that they need to do to go from the old telco infrastructure to the new IT infrastructure is taking a long time. And that might allow the partnerships to get a better advantage in the value chain.
Yeah, I think that's really consistent with a lot of stuff we're writing about at the moment. As I remarked on the previous iteration of this podcast series, just the sheer size, breadth, complexity of the sort of cloud and edge and IoT and 5G opportunity that's presented now makes it seem very unlikely. I think the acronym you used, I think one I've heard is FANG with 2 A's. But that's a bit more sort of specifically internet companies. That's Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. But yeah, you're right. I mean, Microsoft's got to be in there. I think might be the biggest company by market cap again. They keep fighting that contest with Apple, don't they? And Amazon. Anyway, but your point about strengths and weaknesses is a good one. I don't think it's possible for anyone to be really good at it. So I think what I'd like to do is direct it onto Daniel on the subject of sort of strengths and weaknesses, and from a WWT point of view, and maybe even you can mention any findings that you think are relevant to this from your research that you've recently done. Talk a little bit more about the strengths and weaknesses that the telcos have in this space, please.
Yeah, Scott. Hi. Look, I think Henry's spot on the things that we're also seeing in our end, right? And from what we can do about it, right? Which I think the question is, we serve service providers. WWT is a $12 billion company, 30 years in the market. We work with the biggest service providers and hyperscalers in the world. So the question we get often is, given there are opportunities and there are weaknesses on their portfolio, and there is a clear opportunity for partnerships, what can we do about it, right? What are those things? Because there will be many things. It's a large ecosystem. There are a few things that we could do, but we will do okay, and there are things that we could do and we will do very, very well. And we try to focus on those things. From an edge component, a few things that we spot on that are key problems. First of all is the a lack of consistency or clarity on clear return on investment from service providers on monetizing the edge. We talk about it, but different service providers have different opinions around the monetization strategy. We can see that by some companies, aligning with the hyperscalers like AWS, as we've seen, or Google. Some hyperscalers even are software companies, but also from the other end, in other parts of the world, companies like Deutsche Telekom, for example, creating their own spin-off software company to develop edge computing capabilities. So we do not see a consistent way to resolve this problem. And but because of that, and because where we think we feel most kind of stronger support in our customer base, is to drive this risk factor as low as possible. Because people don't, if you can make more money out of it, then why wouldn't you? And I think a lot of the times, this question comes with the what ifs, the risks, the challenges of actually setting up their own cloud infrastructure, own cloud edge infrastructure, and monetize on what is so claimed all the use cases. So I think WWT brings really that kind of capability to, first of all, do risk mitigation. I did mention briefly in our first podcast, we have $500 million lab investment, 4 data centers, more than 300 racks, full of equipment, and peoples and tools and processes, a very robust environment that we do risk mitigation, technical decision making on it. So bringing those ingredients together to bring that information, that insight to our customers faster than before. So trying to diminish that kind of a challenge on that front. The other front is, again, the service providers historically, as we all know, have bought these infrastructures and then operated it. They are network operators most of the time. So we had a classic big logos on the radio access networks who dominates the market, that historically own that kind of space. So bringing that complexity to their hands, and again, I think Edge and Open Run and things on this are all new topics for service providers. It brings challenge they have not done before, right? They are now playing on that SI function that it's not historically their role, and we feel that we can support them on this one. So from a weaknesses perspective, where they are not that mature on the systems integrated components or the large scale supply chain of integrating those solutions and distributing globally, we feel that WWT can help a lot on that point. And the other point, which is also very interesting, is again, I don't think we've mentioned unless the first podcast, we serve more than 70% of the Fortune 100 customers. We do see a lot of enterprise use cases in our labs, and our teams are very well versed on what actually the service providers could use or could do, given the insights that we get from the enterprise customers that we have available. So almost becomes of, we can help you on the operational efficiencies standpoint, because we can spin up things and help you risk mitigate on that point, but also help you give further insights on new use cases and new platforms that the customers could use.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that the telco space needs help. That doesn't mean it doesn't bring lots of strength to it and lots of unique capabilities. Obviously, no one else owns the network, no one else owns the RAN. But it needs help with sort of bringing all this stuff into sort of enterprise verticals, and I guess one thing I'd like to go back to you, Henry, about is we call another name for operators or telcos is communication service providers. But it strikes me that outside of the core service that you touched on in your opening comments about providing the connectivity, they're not so good at providing, let's say, ancillary services or value-added services or something like that. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about how they could improve on that side of things.
Yeah, it's. I mean, one, it has been priority and growth in a lot of sense, and it's quite interesting to see that the production model for an operator is very tree-like. Build a central office, then build some distribution points, and then build some base stations at the end of that, or even some customer endpoints. It's very tree-like. It's very plumbing in the network aspects sense, and I think the loss in focus about providing value-added services at the end of the day has been the transition to try and get to more IP networks, which are a lot more flexible and a lot more homogeneous in sort of the design of that and the skill sets coming through. So we're in that transactional sort of position of trying to actually drive. And the capture of the new services have been, almost used to be saying the network was king, but now the handset is king. Or, do you remember that term, content was king? And now we're in the apps world, it is probably king. So not only do I see that we're enabling a lot of these services, and there's a lot of connectivity revenue, at least 20% of connectivity revenue comes in the value chain all the way up through the app. So there's value in growing that. And I think if all operators ended up providing, the chat service or the flight attendant service or the ticketing service, then we would not have the same level of value increase and productivity increase that we've seen across the markets. And also, it would be very difficult for an operator to enable an enterprise and then provide a service for an enterprise. There'd be no differentiation. And I think we'd lose the respect of the fact that what the operators are actually doing is they're providing a platform by which others can differentiate on to a certain level. Now, what the Edge does is bring the enterprise so much closer to their customer and all their point of activity in what they're actually doing. Now, this is fairly foreign and new for an operator to work on. And it's people like WWT who understand different production models, how to do DevOps differently, how to actually take a developer from the enterprise and actually realize they're going to be pretty close to that customer. And the understanding of what you actually need and the resources, the infrastructure resources, compute power, storage, networking, at various different points in the network. Now, today, the Edge is in the is in the central offices where we used to call the switches were located. So the Edge is coming here out from the regional data centers that AWS, Google, Facebook all have. They're all coming into the core network of an operator. Tomorrow we hope to see that right down to the base station. Now that has to be a consistent infrastructure layer that can be enabled. And I know WWT through their labs are actually trying to work out, okay, how do I get a consistent production model so I can make sure I can IT enable the service layer all the way through to the base station, thereby allowing the enterprises, their developer community, to be right next to the customer that they're trying to serve, or the enterprise service activity, whether that's logistics, whether that's manufacturing, whether that's automation in what they're trying to do. So I would say that, if you look at the voice or SMS revenues, they've been plummeting. But if you look at what we've actually enabled from a service level for communications and the value that we're taking out of that, it is so much higher and so much bigger over the last decade.
Okay, well, you made reference to WWT a couple of times, and I'll certainly give Daniel the last word on this as we're running out of time. Firstly, I'd like to note that us journalists like to still think that content is king, for the record. But True. We'll see whether everyone else agrees. What you described about what feels like the creep of the cloud from data centers to sort of central offices to base stations. I imagine, operators could feel that that's a threat. It just feels like the IT world is slowly encroaching more and more on their territory. But obviously the purpose of this discussion is to invert that and to talk about it as an opportunity rather than a threat. So I guess for the last words, I want to introduce Daniel just to talk about that. If you have any sort of specific opportunities or any sort of extra summation of the opportunity for operators in this sort of growing cloudification of their world.
Yeah, so I think there are two kind of big fronts that we're working on, right? Which I think targets, that problem of monetization and improvement that the Edge is creating. And another term that we constantly hear is this ubiquitous computing, which is, again, getting the resources closer, not only necessarily closer to the users, but if necessary to be close, they will be there, right? If the workload does not need to be close enough, then it moves to the appropriate stack of the of the hierarchical design of. But the point is, again, the network will become a compute in the end of the day, because if you have many compute nodes everywhere connected through the network, that just becomes this big computing mesh that as the applications development continues to develop and evolve, to bring to leverage actually that infrastructure and the best of its ability, then of course then the consumer, the end users, the enterprises will benefit from it. From that sense, I think there are two things. First of all, maybe quickly on the report that we developed, $17 billion we've found on revenue opportunities on six sectors within 4 countries that we've mapped. Again, Germany, UK, Japan, and US. So there are actually talks about it. That people are thinking about how they can use the edge as a platform. So the revenues are nearly there from the service providers to consume. That's one point. The other point is again that streamline operations that we're seeing. A lot of the work, a lot of the cost for the networks is again on that infrastructure, as Henry mentioned, right? So the IT-fication, the cloudification, the change of the way the things operate should not be seen as a threat for the network operators. Of course, as more things becomes cloudified, more players can come into the market, and we didn't even talk about what edge could mean from a private 5G, private LTE perspective, which also people, depending on the countries, can buy their own spectrum. The US, they can use the CBRS spectrum range to actually do their own 5G services. That also talks about who will be actually deploying and delivering these enterprise use cases. So of course it became more competitive, busier. More people think they can do it. I feel that there is no one else better than service providers today and for a foreseeable future that can and know how to operate the network. One thing is deploying and configuring and thinking how is the best optimal way to deliver the service. The other thing is when you hand over the keys of the car to someone else and have them to drive it. So that knowledge of operating the network at large scale with efficiencies will reside for a foreseeable future in the service providers. So yes, it's being more busier on that sense of new players. Hyperscalers are trying to get a slice of the cake, but that's from the infrastructure landscape, which I think service providers should not leave it for them to grab. But the operations side of it is where I think also for a foreseeable future, the service providers will be king on that space.
Okay, thank you very much. It's such a big topic, and you two are so knowledgeable on it. I feel we could talk for hours, but sadly, we've given ourselves a 20-minute threshold, so we're going to have to wrap it up there. But thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thanks for joining us, Henry, and thanks again, Daniel. And thank you for the audience for listening. And we do have one more, so make sure you join us for that. And in that podcast, we're going to dig down a bit more deeply into some of the technological challenges regarding the edge and bringing it to enterprise. So make sure you tune in for that. Okay, thank you and goodbye.